The Good Monsters, Inspired by Actual Events, by Sean Patrick Sayers. It was a father-son trip into the mountains, one of those well-intentioned adventures meant to make up for lost time, as if a weekend in the woods could patch over months of missed dinners and distractions. George was a serious man with a lot on his mind, the kind of guy who woke up thinking about work before his feet even hit the floor. His son Walter, on the other hand, was 4 years old and powered almost entirely by chaos. He had the energy of a Labrador puppy and the general self-awareness of a particularly ambitious tornado. It was an unlikely pairing, but somehow it worked. Lately, though, George had been neglecting the boy. Not out of malice, just life. He left early, came home late, missed all the little moments in between. He used to be the kid standing at the door, waiting for his dad to come home, watching for that familiar silhouette, the smell of aluminum and sawdust from the construction site filling the air. And now it was Walter standing at the door, just as excited. But George was tired. He wanted to be a good dad. He really did. But Walter's favorite pastime was stomping and yelling, and when George asked him, begged him, really, to lower the volume, Walter just looked up at him, eyes wide with sincerity, and said, "But we're just being dinosaurs, Dad." And what could George say to that? He couldn't argue with dinosaur logic. More often than not, he found himself exasperated with Walter, frustrated beyond reason. But then, later, after the boy had collapsed into sleep, George would find himself telling stories about him, laughing at the absurdity of his wild little son. He was proud of Walter, even if Walter didn't always know it. One evening, George turned to his wife, Clara, and said, "I'm taking Walter camping." She looked up, eyebrows raised, a mix of curiosity and suspicion. She knew what it took to manage Walter, an entire team of professionals, really. And yet here was George, volunteering to take him deep into the wilderness, alone. "Are you sure?" she asked, already tallying up all the things she could accomplish in a Walter-free weekend. "Yes," George said. "I'm going to take him into the mountains so he can find his own pack." Clara gave him a long, hard look. "You're not leaving him there, are you?" Walter grinned. "No, he's coming home." A few minutes later, George called Walter into the kitchen. "I'm taking you camping this weekend, son." Walter's eyes widened. "Really?" For the next 2 days, he announced it to anyone who would listen. His teachers, his classmates, the neighbor walking her dog. Every afternoon, when George picked him up from school, Walter asked, "Are we going camping now?" "Not yet, son. We're leaving Friday night." "What day is today?" "Wednesday." Walter let out a long, dramatic sigh. "It's only Wednesday." The next day, the cycle repeated. "What day is today, Dad?" "Thursday, and tomorrow is Friday." Walter groaned, as if time itself had betrayed him. On Friday, George took half a day off work to get everything ready. He loaded up the camper with snacks. Lots of snacks. The kind of snacks Walter's mother would raise an eyebrow at, but secretly appreciate, because it meant George was making an effort. There was milk, cookies, chips, granola bars, for the illusion of nutrition, and a bag of mini marshmallows, which George figured would either end up in hot chocolate or scattered across the camper floor. This was going to be a free-for-all. Walter, once properly fueled, would be an untamed beast, a 4-year-old set loose in the wild, charging through the trees, howling at the sky, utterly convinced he was the king of the forest. George was ready for it. That afternoon, He pulled into the school parking lot with the camper hooked up to the truck. Walter spotted him instantly. "That's my dad!" he hollered, tearing across the playground. "We're going camping!" The other kids stood frozen, their heads swiveling toward Walter in stunned admiration. There was a camper. There was adventure. This was, by playground standards, legendary. And then, strangely, for the 3-hour drive into the mountains, Walter was quiet. Not asleep, just quiet. Then, he was full of questions. "What's the campground like? Are there wolves? Coyotes? Bears?" George shrugged. "Yeah, there's gonna be bears." Walter's eyes widened. "Are you going to fight them?" George thought about that. He remembered when he was a kid and thought his own dad was the strongest man in the world. He also remembered the moment that illusion cracked, that first realization that dads too were just men, capable of being tired, distracted, human. But tonight, for Walter, George would be the strongest man in the world. "Well, son," he said, "if there's a bear that needs to be fought, I'll fight him." Walter nodded solemnly, satisfied. By the time they pulled into the campground, darkness had settled over the mountains. George found their sight and backed the camper in. They were on a hill, perched above the world, where they could see campfires dotting the forest, some close, some far, little beacons of warmth flickering in the night. Walter climbed out of the truck and inhaled deeply. Wow. The scent of pine and campfire smoke filled the air. "Can we have a fire too?" George smiled. "Let's get things set up first." George made sure Walter was wearing a sweatshirt, zipped up tight against the chill. He told him to stay close, to not wander off, and explained that he needed his help setting up the camper. Walter took this responsibility very seriously. Together, they chalked the wheels and set up the jackstands, Walter grunting with effort, nodding approvingly at their work the way a man does after tightening the last bolt on something that probably didn't need tightening. They were having a good time. Then, from below the hill, they heard it. A curse word. And then another. And another. A whole string of them, strung together like a garland of bad decisions. Walter froze, grabbing his father's hand. "We don't say those words." His voice rang out, clear and high-pitched, the way small children's voices always carry at precisely the wrong time. "I know, son. We don't say those words. Those are bad words." But the voice below got louder, its vocabulary seeming to consist of only 4-letter words, spoken with increasing conviction. Walter frowned. "Dad." George sighed. There were 2 ways to handle men like that, violence or law enforcement, and right now he was in no mood for either. So he did the next best thing. He took Walter's hand, led him into the camper, turned on the sound machine, and pulled out a book. "We're not going to have a fire tonight," he said. "No fire?" Walter looked betrayed. "No, son. Let's read some stories. We'll have a fire tomorrow night." Walter considered this. "Okay, Dad. I love you." And that was that. The next morning, George did what any good father would do. He made too much breakfast. He cracked 6 eggs into the pan, far more than 2 people could reasonably eat, and loaded them with ham and cheese because camping wasn't camping without an irresponsible amount of dairy. They sat at the picnic table together, the early morning light stretching long shadows through the trees. The trees were enormous, spared from logging 100 years earlier, standing like old men watching over the campground. Campsites were scattered here and there, some people sleeping in cars, some in tents, others in trailers. A woman walked by with a husky, its blue eyes catching the light just right, looking like something out of a Jack London novel. At the edge of their campsite, George and Walter stood, surveying their surroundings. Their neighbor's tent was open. Around it, half-open packs of cigarettes, crumpled beer cans, and assorted trash. A sort of still-life painting of bad choices. Inside, two men slept, huddled together in what George recognized as a Walmart special tent, the kind that went for $39.99, assembled in frustration, and would inevitably collapse if the wind so much as had a strong opinion. Walter wrinkled his nose. "It was only half set up, Dad." George glanced down at the tent, the two men still snoring, oblivious. "Yeah, they had a long night." Walter kicked at a rock. "Let's go for a walk." "Really?" Walter's face lit up with the kind of pure, unfiltered excitement that only a 4-year-old could muster, the kind that made grown men feel guilty for ever losing that ability. They locked up the camper and wandered down a meandering path through the woods, a well-worn shortcut between campsites. Father and son took their time, letting their feet choose their own way. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the sounds of campers stirring drifted through the trees, someone clinking coffee cups, the faint hum of a radio playing classic rock from a portable speaker, the unmistakable sizzle of bacon in a cast-iron skillet. They walked down a steep hill, passing quiet groups of campers, watching deer that had long since stopped being afraid of humans, grazing with the kind of indifference usually reserved for house cats. Walter stared, mesmerized, as if he'd stumbled into a secret world where deer lived in harmony with campers, eating grass while people ate bacon just a few feet away. They were on their way to the lake when George spotted the ranger station with its lights on. "Hey, let's pop in here for a minute." Inside, just past the door, stood a stuffed bear, frozen mid-growl, its glass eyes locked onto some unseen threat. Walter stopped in his tracks. "It's a bear!" he shouted, his voice filled with the kind of wonder that could make a grown man believe in magic again. Meanwhile, George stepped up to the counter and spoke in hushed tones with the park ranger. They shook hands, and George thanked him. Walter, meanwhile, was torn between staring at a wall of pamphlets, each one promising thrilling adventures in recycling and responsible hiking, and watching a turtle in a nearby fish tank, its little head poking up expectantly, waiting for food or maybe just some entertainment. As they were heading for the door, the park ranger called after them. "Hey, I forgot to tell you. We're posting signs. There've been bear sightings. Make sure you hang your food and don't keep your trash in your car." Walter's head whipped around. "Bears!" he shouted, as if this was the best news he'd heard all year. The ranger chuckled. "Not the friendly kind. These bears won't buy you a drink." George nodded. Walter looked thrilled. They spent the day at the lake, hiking and taking in the sights. By mid-afternoon, Walter had burned through every ounce of stored energy, making it just barely through a peanut butter and jelly sandwich before exhaustion claimed him. He fell asleep mid-bite, smearing jelly across his cheek in the process, but still managing to devour the whole thing. George took the quiet moment to tidy up the campsite. He checked his phone. No reception. That was fine, he thought. Clara would understand. A few minutes later, he noticed the park ranger's truck pulling into the campsite below. The two men tending the fire glanced up warily, the way a stray dog looks at an abandoned building, half curious, half ready to bolt. Then they turned away, staring back at the flames, pretending not to see. The ranger approached the two men with the kind of confidence that only comes with being young, strong, and newly employed by the government. He was still in the phase of believing his badge carried weight, that his uniform commanded respect, that rules, when clearly explained, would be followed. George had seen this before. "There's no drinking in the park," the ranger announced, standing straight, chin lifted. "No alcohol." One of the men stood up abruptly. The ranger, despite himself, took a half-step back. "You don't see any alcohol here, do you?" The man's voice was rough, the kind of voice that came from years of drinking, smoking, and making poor decisions loudly. The ranger hesitated. "Well, we've had some complaints." The two men turned, their gaze landing on George. A long, deliberate stare. George sighed. "Okay, guys, you're messing with my happiness." He had no interest in being involved in someone else's bad idea of a vacation, so he did the smart thing. He stepped back into the camper, closed the door, and watched the scene unfold from behind the safety of tinted glass, the way a man might observe a particularly unstable raccoon rooting through his trash. He lay in his bunk, watching the late afternoon sun stretch long fingers of light through the trees. The world outside hummed with voices, the occasional car engine, the snap of a campfire somewhere in the distance. "Hi, Dad." George turned his head. Walter stood beside him, his face sticky with peanut butter, his hair wild from sleep. "Did you have fun today?" George asked. Walter nodded. "Yeah, Dad. I'm hungry." George smiled. "How about we go into town and get some hamburgers?" Walter's face lit up. "Really?" "Really." Walter grinned. "Okay, I have to pee first. Then we can go." George waited while Walter took care of business. Then they loaded into the truck and headed down the mountain. It wasn't until they hit the first open stretch of road that George's phone sprang to life, buzzing and chiming with a flood of messages. He ignored them. Instead, he pulled up the map and searched for McDonald's. "We're going to McDonald's?" Walter asked, his voice brimming with joy, as if he'd just been told they were taking a rocket ship to the moon. This was a big day. They ate inside. When George was a kid, his father never ate inside a McDonald's. It was always the drive-thru, a roadhouse special. The food was handed through a window, eaten in the front seat of a car that smelled like sawdust and motor oil. But tonight, George wanted something different for Walter. Something small. Something meaningful. He watched as his son devoured his French fries and chicken nuggets, drowning each bite in ketchup, licking his fingers in between. And then, just as they were finishing, a McDonald's employee walked over, carrying 2 entire bags full of hamburgers. George looked up. Walter looked up. "Are you having a party or something?" the employee asked. "We were wondering what you're going to do with 50 hamburgers." George smiled at the kid, the way a man does when he knows he's about to do something questionable but entirely necessary. "I'm making an investment in my happiness." The employee blinked. "Oh, okay." Walter, meanwhile, was staring at the 2 bulging paper bags like they contained the secrets of the universe. 50 hamburgers? His eyes were huge. "Is that for later?" "Yes, son. But it's not for us." Walter's face lit up. "Is it for the bears?" George nodded. "Are we going to feed the bears?" Can we have a campfire tonight? No, not tonight. Walter frowned, rolling his little shoulders. But you said we could have a fire tonight. I know, son. Tonight's a bad night. Tomorrow will be better. Walter considered this, then sighed, deciding that if he had to wait for fire, at least there were hamburgers involved. They drove back up the mountain in silence. The campground was quiet. The men were gone. The only thing left was the darkness. Stay in the truck, George said. Walter unbuckled immediately. Can I get out? George hesitated. Unbuckle, but stay put. I have to go do something real quick. Walter, being Walter, did not listen. He clambered around in the back seat, his small hands gripping the window frame, watching as his dad stepped out of the truck, carrying the 2 paper bags. Then, to Walter's complete amazement, George walked up the hill and began throwing hamburgers into the woods. One after another, sailing into the darkness like golden, beef-filled frisbees. Walter was stunned, then horrified. He flung open the truck door. Why are you throwing those hamburgers? George turned, and before Walter could take another breath, his father shushed him, the kind of shush that was almost a hiss, the kind that meant trouble, the kind that meant a spanking. Walter froze. I'm sorry, Dad. George's voice was low, urgent. You need to listen. Walter swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the seat. He didn't know what was out there in the dark, but judging by the way his father was acting, it was something big and something hungry. We're going to go to the camper and rest now. Inside the camper, they made the best of it. They played board games, told stories, colored with the cheap restaurant crayons Walter had pocketed from lunch. It was fun, simple. The kind of fun that sneaks up on you. The kind you don't realize you'll remember forever. Eventually, through the camper window, George saw campfires flickering in the distance, little golden halos against the blackness of the trees. Then, down the road, a pair of headlights crept up the mountain. He knew it was them, the men from the campsite below. They had gone into town, probably a bar, maybe 2. He could tell by the way the truck climbed the hill in uncertain, uneven swerves, the way the men staggered out once it finally lurched to a stop. One of them, caught in the headlights, made it as far as the picnic table before collapsing onto the damp wood. The other, still behind the wheel, felt safe enough to shut off the lights. And just like that, the world was darkness. George stretched, settling into his bunk. It's a dark night, he said, mostly to himself. Walter, nestled beside him, murmured, and there's monsters out there. George smiled. Don't worry, son. The monsters won't be in our campsite tonight. And then he laughed. At 2 a.m, the monsters arrived. George woke to screams, yells, cries, the kind of sounds that don't need translation. He sat up, listening. Outside, panic was unfolding in real time. A bear! Someone shrieked. Then another voice, higher pitched, fully unraveling. There's 2 bears! George rubbed his face, sighed. The truck's engine roared to life, headlights flaring, tires spinning in the dirt. There was a frantic scrambling, a door slamming, and then, bang! A colossal, world-shaking bang, the kind of bang that wakes up an entire campground. George chuckled. Walter stirred beside him. Dad, what's that noise? The monsters, son. Walter blinked sleepily. The monsters are here? George stretched, yawning. Yeah, but these are the good monsters, the furry kind, the ones that like honey. Walter sat up, still half asleep. What kind of monsters are those? Bears, George said simply. There are bears in the campsite. Walter crawled over to the window, pressing his nose to the glass. I can see them. Then, in the distance, new lights flickered to life, red and blue, winding their way up the mountain road. Walter pointed, suddenly wide awake. Oh, look! The police! And sure enough, 3 patrol cars made their way up the ridge toward the campsite below. George lay back down, pulling the blanket up over Walter's small frame. Tomorrow, he murmured, we're going to have a great fire. And we won't have to listen to those words anymore. Walter sighed contentedly. I love you, Dad. George smiled in the dark.